Madam, you are giving a countdown, no? Madam, we can start.
Yeah, it's live stream. No, go ahead, Chagu.
Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. On behalf of SYFX Treasury Foundation, I welcome all of you to this webinar on internationalization of Rupee. We are overwhelmed with the response, and I must thank each one of you for the support. Actually, before we start the proceedings, I wish to introduce SYFX Treasury Foundation. SYFX Treasury Foundation is an educational initiative formed by a group of treasury professionals who worked in Syndicate Bank over 25 years back. We all had branched out to various places locally and internationally, and we got together to form Treasury Foundation, inspired by our mentor, B.S. Murthy. We conduct webinars on contemporary topics. We organize training programs for corporates and banks, and we strive to be a bridge between practitioners and the policy makers. And of course, we share our daily market perspectives in our website. So we are a Section 8 non-profit company inspired by passion for the markets and treasury education. So right now, actually, we have the basic idea is to transmit experience to the entire treasury market. Actually, that has been our motivation. And now I request Mr. U. Venkatraman, our senior colleague, to introduce the dignitaries of the evening.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Tyagarajan. Two more sentences about SYFX Treasury Foundation. Chagu said after 2 decades, they have come back mainly due to passion along with personal bonding and created a platform for knowledge creation as well as knowledge transfer. The purpose was to create a think tank. The foundation calls expert and market participants for talks on various market-related topics apart from training budding treasury forex officers. So Mr. B.S. Murthy was the inspiration and the impetus. I have great pleasure in introducing Mr. B.S. Murthy, who is a chartered accountant by professional qualification. He was formerly CMD of Corporation Bank and Director and CEO IDR Beti, Chairman NPCI, and served on the boards of financial market infrastructure organizations. He was also the Vice Chairman of FIDI, served as Chief Manager London branch of Syndicate Bank during 1990-94, most critical time as India faced serious BOP crisis, navigated liquidity issues successfully, helped set up centers of excellence for big data analytics, cyber security, mobile banking at IDRBT. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Venkat. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and good morning to Professor Subramaniam, sir. Let me extend you a very warm welcome to you. In fact, we are indeed grateful to Professor Subramaniam, sir. In fact, I've just sent a message a few days ago saying that we are organizing this webinar. It's a very important issue. Given his kind of deep knowledge and ringside view of the developments, not merely in India, but also abroad, we requested him to come and share his perspectives on this important subject. So immediately, readily agreed in a matter of 2 hours. And in fact, incidentally, it is he who inaugurated SYFX at the height of COVID 2020, somewhere in October, November. So thank you very much, sir, and extend you a very warm welcome to you. Also, welcome all the panel members. Then let me say something about which I'm connected with Professor sir. So when COVID-19 struck, many economies across the globe came under severe stress and a sudden shock. And many of the policymakers in many countries, they were panicky. They're almost traversing an unknown world. And then probably they let loose fiscal policy, monetary policy, very profligate, not knowing how to respond, and they are paying a price for it. But India, luckily, was more prudent, more sagacious in policy responses, both fiscal as well as monetary policy. If I may share the secret, one of the most important person behind this policy articulation and conceptualization is Professor Subramaniam sir himself when he was chief economic advisor. Even a degree, but I know the kind of work he has done. I think, Professor sir, we thank you very much for very measured policy responses. I know that you don't take anything without a deep analysis. I think that has put India in good stead. So thank you very much, and extremely grateful that you are here with us. So as you know, this is a very important issue that is coming. I would say that very bold move by Reserve Bank and the government. And there's a lot of confusion in the markets, also confusion in academic circles. What exactly is this move? So if you come back to the subject here, I think Barry Eichen Green, I can't pronounce properly, Jamal could pronounce, I think is right, who once said, US spends few cents to produce $100 bill. Few cents, I think he said some 10 cents or 15 cents. But all other countries have to produce actual goods and services for $100 to get that $100 bill. So all of us, all except US, everyone has to produce $100 worth of actual goods and services to get that. So who would not like to probably ride on that gravity train? Who would not like to probably have this exorbitant luxury that US enjoys? So many countries have tried to internationalize their currencies, but I would say with little success. For many countries, it is elusive as well. So then now we have the new geopolitical risk in the aftermath of Russia and Ukraine war. And it's a kind of new risk. We have seen that the aftermath of the freezing of the Russian reserves with the US Treasury, with the US government. So this new geopolitical risk again revived this opportunity of probably internationalizing their domestic currencies, many countries. So several countries are trying to exploring strategies to reduce the dependence on dollar for at least their international trade. So India also has started this invoicing in rupees of the international trade last year. They're not merely permitted, but the government and RBI, they're encouraging. And if I may say so, they're even marketing this, which is an unusual step, which I would say that most welcome measure. But it is not the first time that India has attempted this internationalizing rupees. Somewhere I was reading during 60s, in fact, rupee was a legal tender in some of these West Asian countries like UAE, Abu Dhabi, Bahrain, 4 or 5 countries, including Malaysia. And then invoicing in rupee is nothing new again, because we had this arrangement with Russia, import of defense equipment largely, and then exporting other goods for a long time. I think 2-3 decades has been going on. And then recent times, of course, this with Iran as well for import of oil. But this time it is different. The context is different. The motivation is different. Probably the key drivers for internationalizing rupee is different. I think it is in this context we need to understand. So RBI's internal group has come out with a report and a lot of recommendations to internationalize the rupee. They've given a roadmap. They spelled out some short-term measures. They spelled out some medium-term measures. They also highlighted a lot of costs, a lot of benefits, a lot of opportunities, a lot of challenges, a lot of prerequisites, preconditions, both in the real economy as well as the financial economy for internationalization of rupee to accelerate. But of course, when I just talk to my friends, when once they've seen that internationalizing rupee, this report, they keep asking me, especially in my morning walks, so our rupee would become a global currency. So rupee would become a reserve currency or it has already become a reserve currency. So there is a mix-up of interpretations, expectations, aspirations. So I think today we have a brilliant panel, and of course, our Krishnamurti sir himself, who will decode and for the benefit of all, what exactly the internationalization mean for this thing. So to my mind, they put it in the simple terms. Today, US dollar performs all the three fundamental monetary functions, as all we know. One is unit of account, number two, medium of exchange, number three, store of value. Almost across the globe, it performs all these three functions. Today, is it that our rupee also, we would like these three fundamental monetary functions to be performed, not merely in India, but also across? If so, what is that we need to do? What is the time frame? What are the institutional arrangements that are required? What are the macroeconomic conditions that are required probably to achieve this? So with these few words, I think let me conclude. And once again, extend a very warm welcome to Krishnamurti sir and all the panel members, Mr. Jamal, Mr. Matthew, Mrs. Annapurna, and Mr. Vivek Kumar. We look forward to your wonderful thoughts and perspectives. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your enlightening welcome address. You have always been giving us a lot of inputs and the context, motivation, and the key drivers for the internalization. And there are different interpretations of expectations of the internalization of the rupee. So I have great pleasure in introducing Professor K.V. Subramanian. K.V. Subramanian is the Executive Director at the International Monetary Fund, the 17th Chief Economic Advisor to the Government of India from 2018 to 2021, and a Professor of Finance on leave at the Indian School of Business. As a Chief Economic Advisor, Professor Subramanian conceptualized India's economic policy during the one-in-a-century COVID pandemic. By currently identifying COVID as a huge supply-side shock, Professor Subramanian balanced supply and demand-side measures, transformed fiscal policy to focus on public capital expenditure, and initiated path-breaking reforms to address structural problems. His foresight and vision enabled the Indian economy to emerge with high growth and strong macro fundamentals despite the Ukraine war following the pandemic. His policy ideas drew on the path-breaking economic surveys he authored on ethical wave creation for a prosperous India 2019-20, the strategic blueprint for India to become $5 trillion economy 2018-19, and the post-COVID economy using public capital expenditures in infrastructure and healthcare to further counter-cyclical fiscal policy 2020-21. Acknowledging Dr. Subramanian's contributions, the Honorable Prime Minister Sri Narendra Modi noted his academic brilliance, unique perspectives on economic and policy matters, and reformatory zeal. Dr. Subramanian has been conferred the Distinguished Alumnus Award by his alma maters IIT Kanpur and IIM Calcutta. A PhD from the University of Chicago, Professor Subramanian's research in banking, law and finance, innovation and economic growth, and corporate governance has been published in the world-leading journals. Ladies and gentlemen, presenting Professor K.V. Subramanian.
Thank you very much. Very good evening to everyone. Thanks a lot, Samamurthy sir, for the kind words, and Mr. Tyagarajan also for a very glowing introduction. I think the context was set very well by Samamurthy sir about the internationalization of the rupee. Let me start by presenting a fact, and from there we can then understand. I'll try and speak about the measures that will be required. If you look at the as a percentage of global transactions, if you look at the US dollar today, almost close to 90% of international transactions, international trade happens in the dollar. If we look at the same number for the Indian rupee, it's about 2%. So as Swami Vivekananda used to say, miles to go before we can sleep. So I think that's the first aspect that we need to remember. 90% versus 2% today. So clearly a lot of ground to be covered, but I think it's it is something which is, I think the time is starting to come. We need to prepare for the same. So I'm going to focus on a couple of things. One, the Indian economy itself, and I want to give you a perspective from having been involved in the policy making. The reason I want to cover this is because India's COVID policy is actually quite symptomatic of a change in the way, if you will, India becoming mature, and having the confidence, self-confidence, and the courage of conviction to think on its own rather than copy pasting from advanced economies. I think and this aspect will be very important as we go along, because most importantly, and this is my take, for the internationalization of the rupee, I think the strength of the Indian economy, number one, how large we are as an economy, and the share in global trade. These are the two key aspects that will really matter when we think about the internationalization of the rupee. For instance, one of the steps that will be required is for the rupee to become part of the SDR basket in here at the International Monetary Fund. And I've had discussions with folks here at the IMF based on what were the metrics that the Chinese renminbi, for instance, what are the hoops that the renminbi had to cross in order to be part of the SDR basket. So if we look at one of the major criteria that the IMF looks at, for listing a currency in the SDR basket, it is the proportion of world trade that currency is contributing to or is part of, and not just 1 year, but a 5-year average. So the IMF uses a 5-year average. If you look at the fifth country right now that is in the SDR basket, it is UK. UK's if you take the 5-year average, in terms of the proportion of global trade, it is about close to 5%. India is not yet there. So I think the overall contribution to global trade, number one, and even more importantly, how we perform economically going forward in the next next couple of decades will be key to the not just internationalizing the rupee in letter, but in spirit. And therefore I want to focus on two, with those preambling comments, let me focus on two key aspects. One, the Indian economy, and second, also talk about the US economy itself and how India may be performing vis-a-vis the US economy. So first, I think all of you have observed, and I've written about this in the Times of India in an op-ed. If we plot the inflation as a percentage of historical inflation on the on the y-axis, so inflation during the last 1.5 2 years, during the twin crisis, COVID plus the Ukraine war, for the top 10 economies, on the y-axis, and plot the 3-year GDP growth, and 3-year because COVID actually led to a decline in global growth and then a recovery. India, as I had the privilege of predicting that India will have a V-shaped recovery. India indeed had that at the macroeconomic level, and many other economies also had the same. So 3-year growth rate is important to take into account the decline and then the rise up. So if we plot the 3-year growth rate vis-a-vis the change in inflation, inflation as a percentage of historical inflation, countries like Germany, US, etc., have been facing inflation that are about 3.5 to 4 times their historical averages. 3.5 to 4 times the historical averages. While India has had inflation that is actually, not only is it well within the bandwidth, has been for some, some months, of course, the inflation exceeded 6%, but mostly, if you look at as a percentage of historical, India's historical average, if we take data from 1960 to 2020, historical average inflation has been 7.2%. And so as a percentage of its historical inflation, India's inflation, recent times has been less than 100%. So India stands out as a clear outlier, on the 3-year growth vis-a-vis inflation. And the reason India managed this well is because, we were able to identify early on that COVID is going to be a big supply side shock. And here I'm happy to share, India was one of the last countries when COVID packages were being announced. India was one of the last because we wanted to really understand, make sure what is the nature of this crisis. All of us were taught in graduate school that every crisis is a shock to demand. That is unambiguous. But for the first time, at least I think in all our lifetimes, we had governments, locking down the economy, telling people to sit at home. And that had to have ramifications, and one had to understand what that meant. And when I was able to get my head around what is the implication of that to me, and I like thinking from first principles. And to an economist, supply and demand are the most basic first principle instruments. So it was clear that that COVID is going to be a big supply side shock. And I think that's where, when we go back and, India had the confidence, even though, and I will acknowledge at that time, the institution that I am now part of, IMF itself, was advocating huge, stimulus, and there was a lot of pressure. Therefore, India, pursued a much more, balanced both supply and demand side. And it's important to understand, unlike demand, where one can print checks and send it, and demand comes back. Supply, expanding supply takes time, because stuff that you build or start building, enhances supply with a substantial lag, 10, 12 months, 1.5 years, depending on the kind of asset that is being created. And therefore, identifying early that this is going to be a big supply side shock, I think benefited India a lot. So the reason I actually am focusing on this is because this is, in its 75-year history, this is a good example of in India, not just following what the advanced economies did, but thinking through on its own, even on demand side, using the financial sector, something that will hearten a lot of you. India, by using the banks for lending to the small and medium enterprises, SMEs and MSMEs, and using microfinance institutions for lending to the urban poor, by adding a sovereign guarantee, India was able to, target. And this is also something that I've written on. If you go and, I think in May 2021, a piece of mine actually where I've explained the rationale, why this led to much better targeting, on the demand side as well. So I think that's an example of how India's policy making is evolving now. And I think this is something that will be very critical for us as we go through. Let me, share why I think I have tremendous optimism about the Indian economy. I'm in the process of writing a book titled India at 2050, and I've been doing some projections for it. Starting with, for instance, what the dollar will be, around 25 years later. So as many of us might have read, those who work in international finance, the Balassa-Samuelson effect is basically what is used to predict when we think about foreign exchange rates over long horizons. It is actually a application of the purchasing power parity, but I'm not going to go into the details, given the paucity of time. But there are, I think, a couple of important changes that have happened in the Indian economy in the last few years. which mean a lot. Historically, if you look at from 1990 onwards, the rupee has depreciated by about 3%, 3.5% on average, every year, between about 3%. And the inflation differential between, India and the US has been around 4.5%. So about 2/3 of that inflation differential is basically what has, sort of back of the envelope kinds has been reflected in the depreciation. Now, going forward, because of the inflation targeting regime that we have put in place, with 4% as the middle, and 2 to 6%, we will have historical inflation. We'll have inflation going forward that will be much lower than what we have experienced, and that I think means a lot for the depreciation of the rupee itself. And in terms of the reforms that we are putting in, addressing many of the structural problems, especially manufacturing sector, and because the manufacturing sector is a tradable sector, and if you go back to our understanding of the Balassa-Samuelson effect, it is basically increases in productivity in the tradable sector that affects significantly the appreciation or the depreciation of the rupee. Going forward, India's tradable sector, manufacturing, will see significant improvements in productivity. I think investment will start coming in as well. So bottom line, I actually think that while short term there will definitely be changes, but I think in terms of its level, I think the rupee has seen its peak, in terms of, I think around 83, 84. I really don't foresee, because if, for instance, one projects 3% depreciation, then one will think that rupee will basically cross 100 at some point in time. But my senses, and I actually will I'll put out sort of a paper detailing these calculations. But I've done the historical, looking at the actual depreciation and the model depreciation using the sort of a variation of the Balassa-Samuelson thesis. I think the data seems to fit very well over long periods, 25, 30 years. And I think that the rupee is not going to go beyond 85, 90. If anything, so over the, just based on productivity differences between that will happen going forward, the rupee will appreciate, going forward over a long horizon. So, 3 scenarios that I actually have thought about. One where India, if you take an optimistic scenario, India's growth will be about 7.5% in real terms. I'm talking about in real terms. And the US growth, let's say, is about 2%. And a realistic scenario where India is likely to have growth of 7%, and about 1.75% growth for the US, and a pessimistic scenario where we have about 6.5% growth in India and about 1.5% in the US. So in each of these cases, even in the most pessimistic scenario, I am looking at, in 2050, I'm looking at a rupee dollar that is about 71, 72. And in the optimistic scenario, about 60, 65, 66. And then if we project from there, the Indian economy actually, based on these growth rates, and by the way, inflation also, I'm taking in the optimistic scenario 4.5% for India. Higher growth will mean slightly higher inflation, and US inflation about 2.5%. I think it is also important here for me to comment that the likelihood of the US having 2% inflation, in the near future is very low. The primary reason is that the US now is, a lot of the problems that US is seeing is because of its fiscal profligacy. The debt to GDP ratio is, significantly high, about 170%, and, will keep increasing. I think the US politics now has become, far too sharp and far too polarized. And so, many of the mistakes that India committed, before liberalization, things like debt waiver, etc. Many of these discredited ideas are actually coming into the US debate, and so I am not very optimistic about US economic policy going forward and US economic performance itself. And so because given their debt situation, and I believe unlike, for instance, them having an their current reserve currency, to me, the dollar being a reserve currency is a Dutch disease that the US has been facing, because of which, if you look at the entire, the manufacturing sector has been, almost hollowed, and, it's shareholder capitalism that has been focusing on. So since the 1990s. So overall, I actually am not as optimistic about the US. Even, and I've those of you who track me on Twitter, I had put a Twitter thread showing that even the banking sector failures that were being seen is because it starts from the fiscal profligacy in the US. So I think if we put all this together, we are looking at, in my opinion, actually, obviously, we have to sort of take in any prediction about over a 20-25 year period with a lot of caveats. But with those caveats, I have I have strong confidence that India could actually, not only in purchasing power parity terms, but even in dollar denominated terms, the Indian economy could be, in all these three scenarios, the Indian economy could be bigger than the US economy by 2050. And I think so as that is a big prediction that I'm making here, and which will be, something that will give enormous strength to the rupee as India's economic might increases. In a year or so, or a couple of years, we will be the third largest economy. And if we look at the demographics, that India is now entering a phase where basically India's demographics will be the big tailwind, while for the advanced economies and for China, it'll be a huge, not as much for US demographics, but for China, it'll be a big headwind. And there are many commentators now who are also talking about China possibly suffering a lost decade, given the tremendous amount of real estate debt, real estate stress, and bad debts that they've built up. And some of the economic policies that have been originating from Beijing in recent years. So overall, I think India's presence in the global economy will increase. Our trade will, especially driven by productivity improvements in the tradable sector, manufacturing sector will go up, which I think will be a big push for the internationalization of the rupee. Of course, all the efforts that we make, in bilateral, for instance, the India-UAE agreement that we've had, I think some of the efforts that are being done with Sri Lanka and other countries, I think will help for sure. But by far, the most important driver of the internationalization of the rupee will be the strength of the Indian economy. And as I said, I have so I'll stop with this reiterating this prediction that it is quite likely that by 2050 India will be the largest economy, the biggest economy, number one economy in the world, not just in purchasing power parity terms, but even in dollar purchasing power parity, quite likely, but even in dollar denominated 2050. That's the opportunity that we are looking at, and that is where I think that will drive a lot of the internationalization of the rupee, because the trade that will accompany it will also be a big contributor to it. I'll stop here. Thank you very much for inviting me and providing me this opportunity to share my thoughts. Once again, Samamurthy sir, thank you very much for inviting me here. And as I tell my children, I hopefully, I'll be around to actually see that day when India is the largest economy, in the world.
Wow. What a prediction, sir. Complete optimism. I think those who walk out of the webinar will say that even under the pessimistic situation, we will have 6.5% growth compared to 1.5% in the US, and the rupee will be at 71, 72. The optimistic level 65, 66. Wonderful predictions. So we eagerly look forward to your book, India at 2050. You have nicely traversed through the way in which India progressed, giving a thrust to the manufacturing sector. And you have highlighted how well, when all the other countries were looking at the demand side shock, India rightly looked at the supply side shock, thanks to the policymakers like you at the helms of affairs. And identifying the early supply side shock helped us to remove all the bottlenecks. And whatever parameters you take, whether it's a Balassa-Samuelson effect or the productivity or the inflation or the PPP terms or the dollar terms, finally we see the bright light and the flashlight at the end of the tunnel. And thank you very much for giving a very wonderful analysis. And what gives me a lot of happiness is that the demography in India is the tailwind. That means we will be cruising at a very high speed, whereas the demography in China, there is a headwind. So definitely our presence in international trade, and we look forward to highly satisfying Indian economy where we will also live to see everything, and eagerly look forward to your book 2050, sir. And it has been really kind of you to have come early in the morning from Washington and gave us the complete perspective of what will happen when India progresses on these measures. Thank you very much, sir. And over to TRV to take over the
Thank you, Professor, sir. Thank you. So nice of you to have come
Thank you, sir.
and share very powerful thoughts.
Thank you.